My X-Men.
Not only does Scott Summers, aka the X-Man known as Cyclops, have several awesome and underrated powers, he's an underrated superhero on the whole. Like, quite often people ask if Scott can win a fight, when they should really be asking how quickly he can finish it. This understatement and oversimplification of his power set is bewildering, but fret not, we're here to help the uninitiated change their opinion on the man who leads the X-Men into battle. So, without wasting a bunch of time doing the like and subscribe request and extending this intro longer than it needs to be, let's cut right to the chase, shall we?
Stay down!
Cyclops' optic blasts are extra-dimensional concussive energy. A lot of people still look at Cyclops and assume his optic blasts work like Superman's heat vision. Easy mistake to make, but it's still completely wrong. Scott Summers doesn't burn holes through things. Instead, he hits them. His beams act as pure concussive force, closer to a battering ram than any kind of laser. That's why, when you see Scott's lasers in actions, you see walls breaking down, sentinels flying backwards, villains getting battered and bruised, but no matter what, you never really see anything melt. In fact, there's some mostly obscure Marvel lore that explains why Scott's powers are the way they are. You see, Cyclops' eyes act as gateways to another dimension, one made entirely of pure concussive energy, and it's often jokingly referred to as the punch dimension for obvious reasons. Scott doesn't generate the force himself, he opens the door and lets that force and pressure pour through his eyes. This same dimension has been mentioned in other places as well. For instance, America Chavez once accessed the punch dimension directly to wreck some invading Chitauri and take down a Leviathan. Scarlet Witch also damaged a dimensional scanner called the Sky Piercer after it glanced into a concussive force dimension and nearly tore itself apart. That idea traces back to an early edition of the official handbook of the Marvel Universe, which described Cyclops' eyes as interdimensional apertures that channel photon-like energy from elsewhere. Later editions rewrote this origin, however, and gave a rather simple Superman-like origin for Scott's powers when they said that Scott's body absorbs sunlight and converts it into force blasts. Marvel editors never loved the punch dimension concept, and writers aren't allowed to use it as the official source anymore, which is kind of a shame. Kinetic force propulsion. Most people have limited Cyclops to the role of a long-range blaster, but that really sells his power short, like criminally short, because it's just such a huge oversimplification of what he can really do. His optic blasts are pure kinetic force, and that makes them far more versatile than fans often give him credit for. Scott Summers can push, slow, redirect, and even move himself with those beams. Once you take that into consideration, the way he fights starts to make a lot more sense, and you look at him differently. One of the best modern examples comes from X-Men 97. When the X-Jet explodes during the course of a mission, Scott fires a sustained blast straight down, reducing his fall and turning a fatal drop into a hard but survivable landing instead of plummeting like a sack of bricks. In the same series, he does something even smarter when he aims his beams at the ground and rides the recoil, sliding himself across the battlefield while still firing at enemies. At that point, his eyes function like a controlled thruster system, and he basically stops being a stationary sniper and serves as a mobile combatant. This only works because Cyclops doesn't fire heat or lasers. His mutation lets him absorb ambient energy, convert it into kinetic force, and release it through his eyes. Now, this has also led to some of us calling his beams punch beams, which honestly isn't too far off. The confusion usually comes from how the blasts look and from decades of pop culture heat vision, and yeah, we're looking at you, Superman. There's even been a few instances in the comics where writers slip up and show Scott melting metal or leaving fires behind, but of course, that's not how it works, and Marvel later corrected these mistakes. Superhuman geometric sense. So we think we've established that a lot of people still underrate Cyclops, and we've never understood why. Scott Summers doesn't win fights through just power output alone, he also uses his awareness, math, and discipline to win battles. I mean, think about it. His optic blasts would be far less efficient if not for his precision. Scott has an almost superhuman grasp of geometry and spatial relationships. In a fight, he reads angles, distances, and surfaces in real time, and he can turn everything from walls and floors to debris and even moving objects into tools. He can fire wide on a target on purpose, bounce the blast back, and strike a weak spot from unexpected directions. When enemies brace for a straight shot, Scott may just attack them from behind by aiming his lasers that way. Needless to say, this has been achieved after years of training, and then there's his sharp mind, which is also why he's led the X-Men on more than a few occasions. Even as a teenager, Scott forced himself to track every variable around him. He learned where a beam would land after a bounce, how force would travel, and how many surfaces he could use before losing impact. In fact, a future version of a younger Scott once showed control so refined that his optic blasts could curve without a surface at all, kinda like Angelina Jolie or James McAvoy's bullets from Wanted. This tells us that his powers are a factor of his intent as well. Underappreciated power-sharing ability, energy absorption, power augmentation, and channeling. Apart from being a damage dealer, Scott is also a conduit of power, a regulator of sorts, and when the situation allows, he becomes a force multiplier. The textbook example of this comes from his younger brother Havoc. Alex Summers generates massive rings of destructive energy and needs a containment suit to keep it in check. The Summers brothers' shared mutation grants them a natural immunity to each other's powers, which opens the door to something rare in Marvel fights, and we're talking about true power sharing. When they stand back to back and fire together, their energy stacks and gets amplified. Across the decades, writers like Dennis O'Neil and Chris Claremont showed Scott absorbing, redirecting, and firing other energy sources through his optic blasts, be it Storm's lightning or some other telepathic force. External power feeds into him and gets released when he wants, and because it's happened so many times, one could say that it's an attribute of his mutation, and yet this list itself is about his most underrated powers, so not too many of us are aware of it. I mean, even in Civil War, X-Men, Scott is forced to cut loose and dump power directly into Bishop, an energy absorber. And when Scott is done, Iron Man measures the output at well over 2 gigawatts, more than a large nuclear reactor, which means that he can augment the powers of others as well. This also tells us that Cyclops is extremely dangerous, so let's just thank goodness he's a good guy. Telepathic resistance. Scott's mind generates a particular psionic field attuned to his optic blasts, and more importantly, he's developed extraordinary resistance to telepathic intrusion through years of intimate contact with powerful telepaths like Professor X, Jean Grey, and Emma Frost. This resistance allows him to compartmentalize information, hide secrets, and even resist high-level mental attacks. But yeah, he's achieved this through years of training, and it's not really an attribute of his mutation. Emma Frost has documented that she cannot access his so-called black box memory because he's learned to protect himself. Over the years, his resistance has been tested by powerful telepaths, but consistently holds, which allows him to function in environments surrounded by the X-Men's most psychically powerful members without compromising his thoughts or mission plans. He can control optic blasts in many ways, from surgical strikes to panoramic devastation. So from what we've already told you, it should be clear that Scott doesn't just fire his lasers in a straight line with full force and hope for the best. His control over his power isn't really binary. It's granular and often precise to a degree that borders on surgical. We can see an example of this during his efforts to save Colossus after he suffered a serious injury and lost Illyana. Kitty phases him, Moira gives Scott an exact magnitude on the use of force, and Scott executes. He dials his blast down to 0.993% and narrows it down into a focused beam, essentially turning concussive force into a repulsor scalpel. When Colossus returns to flesh and blood, the wound closes, which proves that this guy has got finesse, because one doesn't hit decimal points by accident. Scott also understands recoil better than almost anyone in the Marvel Universe. Early on, he learned that firing his blasts without bracing would throw him backward. Instead of fighting the recoil, he mastered it. When Wolverine falls from a deadly height, Scott fires controlled pulses beneath him. The blasts don't stop Logan, but they cut his speed enough to keep him alive. Scott uses the same method on himself when he has no other option. Then, there's been moments where he shows restraint out of necessity. When the X-Men needed a place to land during an emergency, Scott cleared an entire forest to carve a runway. The trees fall, and the jet touches down safely. In another case, Scott and Sunfire combine their powers to dig a tunnel through a seabed. All of this circles back to the long-standing belief that Cyclops cannot control his powers. That idea actually took root because it was believed that he had suffered a childhood head injury. However, ever since Astonishing X-Men number 14, it's been clear that Scott's lack of control comes from mental blocks formed after trauma, not physical hurt. With therapy or psychic help, he can regulate his blasts without a visor. Immunity to siblings' powers. One of the stranger and frankly more revealing facts about Cyclops is that some of the people he fights most often are the ones his powers barely work on at all. The Summers family comes with a built-in problem, and it seems that Scott, Havoc, Vulcan, and even their half-brother Adam X share a rare trait among mutant siblings. They cannot seriously hurt one another with their energy powers. Scott and Alex are immune to each other's blasts. Adam X and Vulcan share that same immunity, so theoretically, every fight between Scott and Alex should lead to a stalemate, but that's not the case. Havoc may boast higher energy output and more control, but Scott never built his career around energy output alone, right? He's got more skills, and that's why he leads the X-Men on so many of their adventures. But let's really dig into Cyclops versus Havoc for a second. In one arc, a plane accident separates them as children, and they end up in different foster homes, which leaves both open to manipulation by Mr. Sinister. When they finally meet again in Uncanny X-Men number 54, a lot of emotional damage had already been done. From that point forward, they clash across decades, timelines, and even broken realities like the Age of Apocalypse. But through it all, what remains unchanged is the fact that Alex hits harder than Scott, but Scott thinks faster and better than Alex. X-Factor number 8 also put them against each other. This chapter of the X-Manhunt crossover places Havoc in direct opposition to the X-Men when he tries to extract Charles Xavier. Scott steps up to do what was necessary and ends the conflict almost immediately. How does he do that? Well, he used his optic blast to shoot into the ground, and the debris that flies from the impact blinds Alex. Then he follows that up with a punch, which is then followed by a rock falling on Alex, which doesn't kill him, but does incapacitate him. In simpler terms, Scott uses the environment like his tools or weapons. Scott has faced power suppression, disabled visors, and the total loss of his optic blasts many times. However, every time that happens, he adapts. Then there's his hand-to-hand training. So yeah, the immunity between the Summers brothers forces them into close combat, and that environment almost always favors Scott. Even in universes where Alex goes all berserk and brutal, the end result of a fight between the two brothers doesn't change. Call it plot armor if you want, but the Age of Apocalypse version of Havoc enforces En Sabah Nur's rule with all violence and no restraint, and Scott still wins. But what makes their dynamic even more interesting is the fact that Scott and Alex do care about each other, and they always have. They simply don't trust each other. Scott is the mutant community's default leader because he plans for worst-case outcomes. Alex, on the other hand, is often guided by emotion or loyalty to one person, most recently Polaris. He does other cool stuff, it's just that it's not usually as righteous as the actions of Scott Summers. And I mean, that's got to be a tough shadow to live in. So if we're being honest, we've always found it telling that fans ask whether Cyclops can win a fight rather than how fast he'll end it. Given time to think, Scott Summers finds a solution. That's all we got for you this time, guys, but if you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos. Thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.